Happy Tuesday, everyone. Thanks as always, for joining us today for CAUTAC meeting number 15. That feels like a milestone of some sort. So the last few meetings, we discussed urban growth expansion areas, excuse me, and with kind of a focus on affordable housing and providing mixed use or neighborhood commercial type services. Today, we are going to shift just a little bit and talk about urban growth boundary exchanges and urban growth boundary management agreements as potential tools for supporting housing goals and accommodating needed housing. But before we dive into those topics, Jenna is going to lead us through our focus area and questions for the racial equity framework.
Yeah, thanks. One moment. Okay. So today's racial equity framework focus area is one that we haven't discussed yet in this group, but it's decision making. And in particular, we'll be thinking about this focus area for today's topics related to UGB exchanges and urban growth management agreements. So the questions under this focus area are: who influence the final rule recommendations? And this could be organizations, individuals, communities. And how does this rule address racial equity in decision-making for local government implementation? So in the context of today's discussion, some things to think about are how local governments can incorporate equity in decisions related to how land is brought in or swapped out. How can rules or guidance about UGB exchanges or expansions influence local governments to make decisions that further equity? And how can we also support or encourage collaborative decision-making at the local level, such as through urban growth management agreements? And I would say this focus area is also very much linked to other racial equity framework areas that we've talked about before, such as benefits and burdens, for example. So how can local governments assess and make decisions to increase benefits and minimize burdens related to UGB amendments? So I just encourage us all to keep these questions in mind as we continue with our discussion today. Thank you. And back to you, Steve.
Thank you, Jenna. So we're going to, excuse me, move on to our first topic of urban growth boundary exchanges. You may have seen in the agenda our overarching questions. How can we address sending out land that has no capacity to bring in land that has capacity? And also, how can UGB exchanges help accommodate needed housing when we typically don't have the required densities and services at the urban fringes? And Karen's I think, gonna lead us off here, and then we're gonna hear from both Beth and Derek today.
Yeah, Beth, do you mind if I just set you up a little bit? We brought an example to illustrate very simplified method is what we've been trying to find, really simple examples to bring home. But we know several of you have personal experiences. So Derek has been generous enough to be able to share after Beth presents a little bit. I apologize. I think the link in your agenda for the Toledo example may not be working for all of you. Let me know. But Beth, just so you know, they may not have access to your materials. But Beth will present on the example. And I think what we're trying to address are some rigidness or prohibition or a lack of flexibility in current rules about how to do a swap and what is brought in and what can be taken out and that like for like relationship. So we want to talk about that a little bit, but we also want to talk about the theme from last couple meetings around: do UGB expansion areas and greenfields necessarily correlate with lower density? Does it have to be that way? Can we introduce higher densities when we think about expansion areas? And how do we do that in the context of a UGB swap if we want to bring in greater capacity? So we'll start that conversation today as well. Beth, does that sound in line with what we have? I'm going to let you share screen if you'd like, Beth.
I will. Before we go into it in depth, I'll just give you an example of a UGB land swap that worked and was fairly easy comparatively. In city of Madras, they had a hunk of land that was in their UGB that actually belonged to the city, and it was right adjacent to a master planning area. And I don't remember how many acres it was. Let's call it 40 acres. And they wanted to take that land out because it was a little too sloped and it wasn't quite the right thing for what the master plan would envision, the private master plan would envision for development right next to it. And it didn't have the right connections in terms of water and wastewater. So they swapped it out for an equivalent 40-acre piece of land that was also owned by the city. That was right next to it and that had better connections into that master plan, that was less sloped, that would be more easily developed. But the key here is that none of that land, or very, very tiny amount of that land, had prohibitive slopes, so slopes above 25%. It was all more mild slopes, so it was a little less easy to develop the land that they swapped out, and easier to develop the land that they swapped in. And the owner happened to be City of Madras in both cases. So it was kind of the easiest version of a land swap, and whatever was swapped out and what was swapped in got the same zoning designation. So it was very much like for like, same zoning designation, same amount of land, very little land was constrained. And so then let's look at a counter example to that, with City of Toledo, little tiny city over by Newport. We did their housing needs analysis a while ago. They have quite a lot of land you can see that is zoned for housing. Pay attention to this light green and this dark green, because those are areas that are inside the city limits that are, sorry, areas that are inside the UGB that are outside the city limits. And I've never worked in a city that was as constrained as Toledo. You might look at this and go, why does Toledo exist there? It's just, they laughed at me every time I said, wow, your city is very constrained. And they were like, yeah, we can't really build here. So you've got a big estuary, steep slopes, lots of landslide susceptibility. You can hardly see where there is land for development. And so this map shows in the orange vacant land, and in the yellow land that is partially vacant, but it's pretty big parcels. So you don't have a lot of development there. And then all of the gray is stuff that's already developed. And you can see they've got a lot of vacant land, but these hash marks symbolize over top of it that they've got a lot of constraints. I'm just zooming in so you can see it a little bit better. And when you look at their buildable land map, this is what they've got. It's like 26 acres of land. Toledo would really like to play a role in supplying housing in the Lincoln County region, you know, the Newport region, where you could get housing that's off of the coast that is, you know, potentially a little more affordable and not such a long drive to Newport. And Toledo also has, you know, a sawmill and that kind of thing. So, you know, some good jobs locally. Toledo would like to do a land swap. They were very excited about this when we were talking about it. And then it became clear that you could only do a land swap like for like. So buildable land for buildable land rather than unbuildable land for buildable land. I mean, I'm going to point to areas on the map, and I haven't had any discussion with landowners, any discussion with the city in a few years, but a whole bunch of this land over on the east side of Toledo, where you have a lot of vacant land, a lot of large lot, partially vacant land, they would like to swap out. And as I said, it is within the city limits. sorry, it is within the urban growth boundary, but not in the city limits. So it's got residential zoning designations, which would remain the same if you swapped it out because it's county zoned. And so if Toledo was going to do a land swap, they could, under the current rules, gather up a bunch of this, small, vacant, unconstrained stuff, and swap it out for something. I think they were probably looking up here around Highway 20. I don't remember exactly. For land that was flatter and more buildable, and unconstrained. They can't do that under the current rules. And so if you allowed swapping, constrained land for vacant land, then they could actually participate in the regional development community and provide opportunity for some housing that's more affordable comparatively. We're not talking necessarily income restricted affordable housing, although there could be some of that. So that is the example of where the current system isn't working well, and could work better.
Yeah, and maybe we'll pause here for any questions before I ask Derek to sort of share a little bit of their experience with that like for like. Steve, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, Ted's got his hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Beth, when you were describing how they weren't able to swap the land because the like for like issue, have they attempted to go through the standard process of establishing a need for an urban growth boundary expansion?
I will say that
land's not buildable, then that would be a path.
They did not try to do a land swap, to my knowledge. And their forecast is so small, because the forecast for growth is so small there. And they've got 26 acres of buildable land. So justifying what do you call it? Justifying a UGB expansion based on their forecast of, I could be wrong about this, but I'm kind of remembering growth of sub 10 households. That just wouldn't work. I think some of that, Ted, comes down to the fact that the way we think about housing need and land need is based on, solely on growth rather than looking at it, outside of metro in a more regional way, and saying, hey, development is hard in Newport, which Derek will talk about in a few moments. But there's an awful lot of demand for housing in the Central Coast region. Maybe Toledo is a good place to see that. And one way to get at that would be a land swap.
Any other questions for Beth? All right. Helen, you want to, or do we go just to Derek, or do you want to say set Derek up like you did Beth?
I kind of want to set up Kevin real quick as Derek speaks. So Kevin, I think one of the things I might turn to you is maybe some of the rationale behind our existing rules, because I'm sure there were reasons why they wanted some like for like. And if not, that's fine if that goes way back and we're trying to work through that. But as I see such, as we all face the housing crisis and the opportunity in front of us with rulemaking to address the housing crisis, I think one of our charges is to reduce barriers. So trying to understand why these barriers exist. But Derek, if you could shed some light on similar and different barriers, slightly different, what's happening in Newport and the need for an exchange there.
Sure. Do you hear me okay? All right. So in our circumstance, our terrain is very similar to Toledo's in terms of what we have. The city of Newport survey boundary is surrounded by fairly steep slope timber properties, most of which are not anywhere near the services that you would need to have in place to support urban scale of development. So I want to be very clear that most property outside our UGB we would have no interest in. We're having a hard enough time serving what we have inside our UGB, let alone reaching out to grab additional acreage. However, we did run into a unique circumstance where we have 40 acres on the north side that's just outside of our urban growth boundary. It's under a commercial forest designation, but it's immediately adjacent to urban services, excuse me, that we have scaled to support high density residential development on neighboring properties in the area. And so we had conversations with that property owner because that particular piece, borders the city on two sides and then has a large utility easement across the north end. So it's kind of an isolated timber property. So they're not, it's not something that particular timber company wanted to continue to hold on to for commercial timber purposes long term. So they were open to doing a swap. And they reached out to a property owner who we were able to line them up with, who owns property on the south side of the city. That property owner owns 70 plus acres inside our urban growth boundary. However, they're outside our city limits. They had withdrawn from our city limits a few years back because the area where they were located was not going to be urbanized anytime soon, and they wanted to do a single home on their property, and that was the only way they were able to do it. The county, because the property was still within our urban growth boundary, put a rural residential designation on that piece to the south. So as we got into this, we ran into a few things, but one issue that they ran into had to do with the process of navigating both a city approval process and a county approval process. That they received a timely decision from our council, but the county did not take action on their request, and there were a number of reasons for that. I'm not blaming the county, but I think we have to keep things in context sometimes. We had the Echo Mountain fire that significantly impacted Lincoln County. Their limited staff resources were largely directed at helping people get back into homes and addressing other things that are under their jurisdiction that they have time limits on. And they have no time restrictions with respect to dealing with UGB land swaps, so that was not prioritized. So that was one issue. Another issue has to do with this provision in the land swap that if we're relying on our existing lands needs analysis, then for residential need, you have to have that substantially equivalent amount of buildable residential land is removed. Now, this is an area down there that's 70 some odd acres. That's all commercial timberland down there. And as part of that swap, that owner was more than happy to swap out equivalent acreage and have that placed under commercial timber designation. But when it came to buildable residential land, that ate up a whole lot more of their property, and they weren't prepared to swap that much out. And that's a part of that swap that bogged down. For us, that's if it's going to be going into a commercial forest designation and the land that is being swapped out is suitable for that purpose, I don't understand why an equivalent amount of buildable residential land is even part of the discussion. It doesn't really make any sense on our end. We have a difficult time explaining it. And so that was a part of the problem. One thing to keep in mind is that a lot of the residential land in our jurisdiction, and I suspect that's the case for a number of smaller communities, a lot of the land inside our urban growth boundary that's residentially designated goes back to when the city's original plans were acknowledged back in, for us, it was 1982. So we've got some of this residential designated land that's not close to any services. Little thought was given when those original designations were made as to when or if the city would be able to provide services to those areas so that they can actually urbanize. And so they've languished inside our urban growth boundary, technically as residentially designated, properties for urbanization for over 40 years. So, another piece that might be a nice piece of this, if we could work this out, is one, giving cities the authority to remove properties if they've been sitting inside an urban growth boundary for that kind of period of time with no analysis that really shows that they're wherever urbanizable, given they're not proximate to any services, that kind of thing. But also what can be done to streamline this process so that we don't have these swap applications sitting, having to go through 2 rounds of review, first with the city and then the county. Perhaps, on the county side, there could be a way to expedite that, where the property would get a default zoning, that's consistent with what's out next to it, if it's withdrawn from an urban growth boundary. But some thought should be put to the process to make it a little bit more manageable. It certainly didn't work for us as it's currently structured.
Thanks, Derek. Any questions for Derek? Okay. Oh, Karen, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm thinking, Kevin, we have a few swaps happening, whether it's Roseburg or Grants Pass. You probably know of others in recent years. In cases like Madras where it works really well, and then in cases like Newport and Toledo where they're really struggling. And for me, one of the questions that I'm really grappling with is to Derek's point, cities who have land in their UGB since time of acknowledgement or 30 years, how do we facilitate that land coming out of a UGB being swapped out, and then understanding what it might be designated as it goes out? Because we don't necessarily foresee it coming back in. In many cases, it's far too constrained, and they've had challenges servicing that land. But understanding that we want contiguous UGBs, and what does that look like to swap something out on the north end of town and swap something in on the south end of town and keep that continuity, but needing extra capacity. I mean, really being genuine about needing that extra capacity and taking off the books, off the inventory land that has proven little to no capacity. So any thoughts you want to share with us, Kevin, around that, and maybe why the rules want a like-for-like swap? What were they trying to achieve with that?
Sure. Happy to talk about it. And, full disclosure, I've been working with Derek and other folks at the county on this exchange for a while now. And I will say, there's increased interest in UGB exchanges in recent years. We had, I think, as a department, not focused so much on the process. So, once we really drilled down on the language about buildable land for buildable land, I can't articulate what the thinking was. I'd have to go back into the legislative history to really try to figure out why the stipulation was buildable land for buildable land. What I can say is that Newport is not alone. There's a lot of cities out there that are still working with the urban growth boundary that they initially established, often in the early 80s. And the level of analysis that was done at that time on developability really varies. And I've talked to numerous planners from around the state about, I don't know why they included this area. It's going to be very difficult to get services there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a challenge that we've struggled with. I'd really love to hear from this group, if there's some ideas about why it was buildable land versus, for buildable land. I'd love to hear some perspective on that. I will say, if cities want to remove lands that are not buildable from their urban growth boundaries, they could do that unilaterally. It doesn't require an exchange. That said, they cannot remove lands from their UGBs if it puts them in a deficit for employment land or residential land needs. So I don't know if I answered all of those questions. I think, Karin, one of the other issues that we've run into is the zoning that is appropriate for lands that are removed from an urban growth boundary. And that has been a little bit challenging too, because as our understanding of the rules is, you go back to that time prior to the UGB designation and determine were these exception lands, were they resource lands, and those lands should revert to that pre-existing zoning. Sometimes that can be a real surprise to the property owners. they're less excited about being part of that swap. So that is also a challenge that we've encountered. Sorry, I'm a little froggy today, but looks like Martha, you had a comment or a question?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this. I'll try to make sense. I mean, I wasn't around obviously when these rules went into effect, but I feel like if I had to speculate, it's a little bit of a math problem. I mean, in theory, if your urban growth boundary has enough capacity to support 20 years of growth and you're trying to add a new area, then you have to take out an area. I mean, it's that I would think that's why is a like for like. But I think the farther we've gotten away from the original urban growth boundaries, the harder it is to do that math, because you're right. I mean, I wonder if there's some way to be able to consider not just what we would call buildable land now, but, you know, somehow make some assumptions about what was assumed to be buildable in the past. And it may not be possible. It may not be easy to do that consistently across jurisdictions, but it's a weird position to be in, right? Because this land was brought in and it's zone low density residential. There was some sort of assumption at the time that it was going to develop, right, at a certain density, but now we're saying, no, it's too constrained, it can't. And that's not really fair, that because it's not buildable land as we see it now. And so I'm wondering if there's some way to factor in that kind of a consideration. But I feel like this idea of buildable land is to get around a jurisdiction trying to do an exchange to really expand the urban growth boundary. Because if it's truly not buildable land and you're adding buildable land, that's an expansion. You know, that's a UGB expansion. It's the math. So those are my initial thoughts. The zoning question is an interesting one too. I'll have to think about that a little bit. You know, not every county is the same. I'm with Clackamas County. We often don't put land into any sort of future holding zone inside the urban growth boundary, so it just stays in the rural zoning. And so that's the easy sort of situation. But if it's in a future urban zone, or if it had been in the city, yeah, I mean, I think most logical thing to do is go back to what it was, but you'd have to be very clear up front about and know what it was.
Thanks, Martha. Go ahead, Kevin.
I just want to clarify and kind of respond a little bit to what Martha just said, that, you know, when we look at buildable land for buildable land, well, what is that, right? So we do typically default to the definition in Division 8 of Oregon Administrative Rules for what buildable lands are. However, I've heard from a number of planners, and Derek is one of them, who've said, look, if you disallowed, if we didn't allow development on slopes in excess of 25%, we wouldn't have a lot of buildable land in my city. So that happens, and we understand that it does happen, and we're not about precluding housing opportunities, but it does also, you know, that is kind of the default that we are led to when we're looking at what defines buildable lands.
Beth?
So thinking about what Kevin just said and what Martha said, going back in the past and figuring out what things were before, I would imagine would be very challenging, or, you know, the rationale for why did we put the thingy up on the hill, the boundary up on the hill. I've heard various people talk about why those decisions were made, and they were in the room, and it really had nothing to do with thinking about buildable land at that time. It was just, oh, that's a convenient place. Maybe we look at a solution that's something like, if you're taking out constrained land, you take out, you know, for every 2 acres of constrained land, you can swap in 1 acre of unconstrained land, or something that's, you know, not the exact same number of acres, and that, you know, whatever that ratio is, if there is a ratio, that is a stand-in for the fact that things are different now than they were in the 1980s when UGBs were set, and we think about densities now differently, that kind of thing. But that would help at least some cities.
Thanks, Beth. Heather, and then Derek, and also include or encourage anyone else who's looked at UGB exchanges or as part of your land use planning and to share what your experience has been. Go ahead, Heather.
Yeah, we have not looked at that, so I'll keep my comments brief. But I was thinking about why the rules might have been written the way that they were, buildable for buildable or like for like generally. And I wonder, one of the things that we've struggled with is when land technically meets the definition of buildable, but there are other constraints that we're not allowed to consider as protected or non-buildable that really make a property difficult to serve or unlikely to develop for some reason. And so that might be a reason that, swapping buildable for buildable, it looks like you're swapping buildable for buildable on the surface, but that there's other reasons that this property is really unlikely to develop. We've talked previously at this group about like if you had a property where it's effectively surrounded by non-developable land, and then there's like this developable piece in the middle, that might be one that would be eligible. The non-buildable part would be eligible right now, but that buildable piece right in the middle, that island, unlikely to develop, right? But technically is buildable. So I guess I would also just based on that encourage us to think about maybe the way it is written is okay as one option, and then we are identifying other options to address other scenarios where you're replacing non-buildable with buildable or whatever those other options are. But I'm just wondering if we really want to replace that or if we're just trying to find other options, additional options.
Go ahead, Derek.
Thank you. Just a couple points. One, I have to wonder if at the time that was done, there wasn't a lot of thought put to, hey, those lands removed from the urban growth boundary could be put into a resource classification. In which case, really, the amount of buildable land going out really shouldn't, in my opinion, be the discussion point. Is that land suitable for whatever that resource designation is, farm or forest uses? And that should be the discussion, not is it an equivalent amount of residential buildable land. The other piece I just wanted to put out here is it would be nice to see some consideration for the fact that when you're looking at doing a swap like this, you have a property owner who's prepared to develop. It's an actionable piece of land where they're prepared to build homes. We're in a housing crisis. One would think that would be a consideration in the process if they're prepared to make commitments to move forward to develop that land if it's brought into the UGB. That's a pretty significant positive step forward. From our perspective, we have plenty of residential land in UGB, and it's not moving forward, because the property owners don't want to develop at this point in time. There are a lot of different factors for it. So if you have somebody in a UGB swap who's pursuing that because they're prepared to actually develop that property with homes, I think that's a pretty significant factor that should be accounted for.
Thanks, Derek. Brock, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess so, kind of related to what Heather was talking about with also the contiguous UGB piece, right? So imagine that the reason that we don't want non-contiguous UGBs is so you don't end up with something like this, right? Where you have like the city and the UGB there, right? And then there's this other disconnected pocket of it, right? But as far as the constrained land, like encompass, surrounding buildable land, if you had, this pocket right there and like all of this constrained, can you pull that out? That little portion of buildable, just take that out? Is it, or would that be considered non-contiguous?
Well, I think that's one of the conversations we had with our buildable land inventory around islands of buildable land, remember? And how to treat those, to Heather's point. And I remember, I'm taking this out of context, Mary Kyle, I know, but there was a comment about reducing capacity. So in the inventory, when I look at that island of buildable land, it's constrained to service. We can't figure out our public works department how to service it. Can we reduce some capacity on that? So it's still part of the inventory, but it comes with a very different capacity. And I think that's a conversation that's very related. And then when I think about a swap, you're looking at land, that to Derek's point, it hasn't developed over 30 or 40 years. It could go back to a resource. It could be forest land for a forest resource. It could be farmland. And you're completely taking it off your inventory. You're getting it completely off the books. And so I think those are related conversations, and we need to think about that when it's on the edge of a UGB and we can swap it out versus when it's an island inside the city. And maybe we treat those differently. Hopefully that helps, Brock.
Yeah, just because I'm thinking if it's truly, an island of buildable land and you're not going to be able to get the services in there, it doesn't make sense to cut the capacity in half. That capacity is zero if you can't get the services out, particularly if you're, also running into things where like, okay, you can't put septic in because it's technically close enough to the rest of this sewerage system to be able to connect it, right? But you just can't get it there.
And that's a conversation we'll have in draft rules for sure, because I'm completely taking Mary Kyle's comments out of context, Mary Kyle, so I'm building off of this, that if you are reducing capacity, is there a spectrum? And part of that spectrum is a reduction of capacity all the way down to zero. It is in my UGB, it is in my city limits, but there is, and we haven't figured out the methodology for that spectrum of capacity from 0 to 20 to 50 to
right.
To be determined. That is part of our thinking about it. So I see where you're going, Brock, with the island within your UGB or city versus on the edge. It's contiguous. How do we swap that out? So I appreciate that. Steve, I don't know who's next. Thank God you're here. I'm gonna.
Well, we've hit on a popular topic. So, Damien, go ahead.
Thanks. We have some historic experience. When I say historic, more than 20 years ago, of doing swaps. But that's not what I'm going to ask about. My question is maybe a little bit more hypothetical. Has it been allowed, or could the rules allow a situation where a city would swap out, say, a parcel of land, but include a smaller parcel of land in the exchange, provided you were dealing with the, say, maybe same or greater capacity for housing or jobs, depending on what you're looking at. Because I'm thinking of like some of the properties we have around our edge, like topography hasn't been an issue yet, but it could with some. And that's my question. Thank you.
May I punt that to Kevin with great, thank you, volunteered with the comment that, when I think about like for like, I think it was that, that you could exchange different acreages, the quantities wouldn't match up, but the capacity, maybe the buildability. And I could be off, Kevin. Thank you for jumping in.
Yeah, sure. And great question, Damien. Actually, the rules, this is another area we might want to talk about. So in 0070 and Division 24, there's a provision that says local government must apply comprehensive plan designations and urban zoning such that the land added is designated for the same residential uses and at the same housing density as the land removed from the UGB. So it really is a like for like in that regard as well. Same for employment uses. It talks about for the same employment uses as allowed on the land removed from the UGB, just FYI. Does it have to be that way? I don't know, but it's maybe something we could talk about. Because we do often see that cities are in need of higher density. So why should we create a problem if somebody wants to bring in more higher density land and take out lower density land? That would make sense to me.
Mary Kyle.
Well, since Karen invoked my name during the what Rob was saying, I think I have always assumed, and I've only seen the swaps done with property at the edge of a city. The first one I was involved with was Milton Three Water in 1992, which I don't know if that was the first one the department ever did, but around 1992, it was a long time ago. Not controversial at all. They took out an orchard that was in the city UGB that the orchardists never wanted to be in, and they brought in the property where they realized they were going to put their reservoir or something like that, or something. But in any event, I think removing property from the middle of the city is a political and practical nightmare. If it's not developable, I can't imagine the private property owner would be happy about that. And then you've created an island. Is it governed by the city still? I just think if it's privately owned, that person's whoever owns it's going to find some way to build at least one house on it if they have enough money, because often that's just what the issue is. But in any event, I would just, as Karen said, reduce the capacity of it. But I just think there's maybe even I think that's could be very politically and practically challenging to remove property that's surrounded by city urbanized property. And it would be unrealistic to think it's going to go back to some prior use if it was in farming or forestry. I like the idea of a capacity, looking at capacity, not amount of acres. That doesn't really make much sense as it's written to me, as opposed to bringing in maybe smaller acres that has a higher capacity for development. But I do think even land at the edge, taking it out and putting it back into its original zoning, whatever that was, if farming or forestry, maybe the land, depending on what's happened to it while it's been inside the urban growth boundary, could be farmed. But if it doesn't have trees growing on it now, to think it's going to go back into some commercial forestry use is kind of unrealistic, I think. So anyway, those are just a few random thoughts.
Thanks. Thanks, Mary Kyle. Karen, go ahead.
I thought there was a hand ahead of me. I was going to pose a couple more questions.
Well, before you get there, I was just wondering, Ted, you had your hand up earlier, and I'm just interested in Metro's experience with UGB exchanges, or any
Sure.
thoughts you have to share.
Yeah, a few things have come up. I agree with Martha that I think the original intent, and I wasn't around for it either, is really that we're not expanding urban growth boundaries without showing a need for it. And that's why we have this buildable land for buildable land requirement. And I think a lot of the comments that people are making speak to the challenges of objectively identifying what we count as capacity. And Karen was getting at this. There's buildable land, but how much capacity does it actually have? That's something that we've been dealing with in our growth management decisions a bit. And we do have some experience a couple of years ago with an urban growth boundary exchange. I think in Metro's context, it's politically more complicated. And Martha's smiling. That's good. Because Metro controls the urban growth boundary, whereas we're essentially, the perception is that we're taking from one jurisdiction to give to another in our region. So it's politically more complicated in our region. And then I guess the last thing I'd notice is that Kevin was bringing up this zoning for the same housing density as the land removed. No, that doesn't make any sense. In our case, when we conducted an exchange, the area that we removed from the boundary was in Clackamas County. It didn't have any future urban zoning designation. It was still in the original county rural zoning designations. So we wouldn't want to add land and zone it for that. It sort of defeats the purpose of what the exchange is intended to accomplish. So a random assortment of thoughts there. Thanks.
That's great. Brock?
Karen, do you want to go first, or I have a kind of related but different idea. So if Karen's is more,
yeah, I think you're related because I'm going to pose some questions in regards to how we might go about draft rule writing. Yeah, go ahead.
So recently I was thinking about the portion statute where, after House Bill 2001, right, you can only assume 3% capacity increase without quantifiable validation of otherwise. Could we have, for example, the islands say, okay, if you can demonstrate, right, that this is not going to develop, even though it's technically buildable land, you can take that out of the buildable lands inventory. You just have to do a demonstration, right? Like say that, like, okay, this is too much slope to be able to pump the water up there, or, whatever the constraint is to getting that infrastructure there so that something can be developed. If you can demonstrate that, like, that's a real constraint, then can you pull it out? In the same way that if you can demonstrate that you can get increased capacity above 3%, then you can plan for capacity above 3%.
Yeah, I think when we consider draft rule writing for buildable lands inventory and housing capacity, estimating housing capacity, I think we will want to look at what is a methodology for reducing capacity. And to Mary Kyle's point, do we reduce it all the way down to one dwelling unit, just assuming that if a millionaire wanted that $1 million view and could pay for pumping the water up there, that it would have one dwelling unit and it would be like a half-acre lot with $1 million view up on a slope. So I think, we have some rules for safe harbors in the inventory around, if it's a 1 acre lot and one dwelling unit. And I think we'll have to look at that for sure. And then I think, Brock, what you're trying to tie that to is here in the expansion, when you think about bringing in land or taking out land, how does that happen in relationship to a UGB amendment?
No. Not even in relation to a UGB amendment, just recognizing that, like, this portion of land is not going to develop because of whatever reason, it's been here however long, right? We've seen that this isn't going to happen. It's not even changing the UGB at that point. It's just saying, okay, in our next BLI, we're not going to count it as buildable because we've seen that it has too many constraints in one form or another for it to actually be buildable land, because it's, on an island that's surrounded by undevelopable area.
Yeah, I think we'll come back to these conversations in the spring around buildable lands, but it goes back to Heather's point of, you have in Division 8 your definition for buildable land and the constraints you're allowed to remove land. Outside of that, that's up to us to write the rules if we're going to expand on that for the inventory. And a lot of cities are having their difficulties, to Heather's point of, yes, on paper, it's strictly buildable, technically, per rules and statutes, but in practicality, we know there's a very, very little likelihood. And to Mary Kyle's point, the barrier is money. With enough money, anything is buildable, but is it practical in that 20-year planning horizon? I see Beth and Kevin. I'm gonna pose two questions to think about while I turn it over to Steve. So just think about, as we're listening to both Kevin and Beth, if we were going to write rules around UGB swaps, should we consider rules that would allow land being swapped out? Does it revert back? Currently, the status quo to revert back to its original designation prior to being added to the UGB, that county zoning. Should we consider it would revert to adjacent land? So you're swapping it out. What is that county zoning that's adjacent to? Is it farm? Is it forest? Is it a multitude? It is in proximity and abuts different designations. How do we think about designating that out? And then I think folks I'm taking, and I'll take head nods, that it sounds like there's quite a bit of support for swapping out what has been designated maybe low density, but bringing in land at higher densities. So not having to do that like for like density, it sounds like there's a lot of support for that. Would there be support for us to consider rules? Well, if you have to demonstrate land need to accommodate housing, should there be a minimum density? We're you know, bringing in low densities, maybe not going to meet your housing need per the ONA housing need allocation. Should the land swap have to respond to your housing need allocation? So I'll let you sit on that. And then Steve, I have no idea whose hand.
Yeah, I think Kevin, maybe you had a response to Brock's comments from earlier.
Just a quick clarification. Thank you, Steve. So the current definition of buildable land does include if land cannot be provided with public facilities, it can be considered to not be buildable. We have said that cannot be provided with public facilities is a pretty high bar. We interpret that as meaning it technically can't happen. So to go back to that millionaires example, if it can be done, then it wouldn't quite meet that threshold. I'm not saying that's the right answer, but I'm just telling you it's there in the current rules. So
Thanks, Kevin. Mary Kyle, and would like to hear from folks on those questions that Karen just posed. You're on mute, Mary Kyle.
So I'm not sure if this is a scenario that Karen painted or not, but if the land that's taken out of the UGB, we've determined it's not buildable for some reason. So it seems it should have even though I think the likelihood of something going back to forestry is wrong, but it should still have a rural farm or forest designation, it seems to me, because otherwise, if it has some development zoning, then there's an acknowledgement that it is developable. I mean, it just doesn't kind of make sense to me to take it out because it's not buildable or developable and then give it a development zoning. And if it is actually developed, then you're going to have that exurban sprawl at the edge of a city as a result of taking it out and giving it some low density exurban density. So it seems to me it would not be zoned for development. It would be zoned for rural farming or forestry or natural resources or something like that. And we want, and how the land should be zoned if it's brought in, that bringing in a smaller amount of land at a higher capacity density seems a more efficient use and maybe better meets the city's housing needs. I think we have to be careful this isn't used, as I think Martha said earlier, as just a way to get around UGB expansions, through some, or said something like that. That might have been the original thinking behind it. And I'm sure that probably was. But I think that would be a plus if there was less land being brought in, but it could be brought in at a higher density and related to the city's housing need.
Great, thanks. Martha.
Thanks. A couple of things. I like the idea, looking around the room, I think it was maybe Heather, of retaining the current rules, maybe making some adjustments, but retaining these current rules as an option and maybe thinking about how we could add another option in these scenarios where there was land that was brought in that was sort of assumed was going to develop, but now we're finding out, it's the land that sits there forever and ever, and we're finding out it's not really developable. I think we do need to keep in mind that the way the rules are written now, it gets you out of having to do a new housing needs analysis, or I guess an EOA as well. And so that's the whole point, is that you're getting to just swap sort of like for like. I like the idea of looking at it as a capacity issue rather than the residential type that's described in there. But it truly is intended to make an easier, faster process for jurisdictions, so they don't have to go through all of the analysis you have to go through the UGB expansion. And I feel like that's a good option, that we need to keep it in there. I'm not entirely sure how you would sort of work the not truly buildable land that we thought was buildable when we brought it in and exchange it for something that truly is buildable without doing a needs analysis. But I feel like that would, something along those lines would be the second option available for an exchange, if that makes any sense. And then when we're talking about zoning, I think it's a little more nuanced, but I mean, I think Mary Kyle's right. You don't want to pull something out of an urban growth boundary and give it, you know, a 1 acre rural zoning district and then create these big rural subdivisions right outside the boundary. But I think, I mean, I think a lot of these lands might have been farmer forest when they're brought in. Some of them were rural residential. And I think we need to look at either what it was or what is on the property right now and find the closest rural designation. So if there's a house on the property, maybe it's a rural residential, but it can't divide any further, right? Or if there's nothing on the property and it's really, you know, forested and it can continue to be forested, then maybe that is what's appropriate and it's not buildable. But I think we do need to consider what is developed on the property at the time, which might be one house. And so sure, that's all they get outside the urban growth boundary too. Those
Thanks,
are my
Martha.
thoughts for right now.
No, that's great. That's great. And this issue is again very tied to those previous conversations about buildable land inventories that we had a few months ago. Let's go to Derek and then we'll go to Madeline. Oh, I see Heather too. Maybe we'll go to Heather and then Madeline, and Madeline, maybe you can help us transition to our next agenda item as well. So Derek, go ahead.
Yeah, I would just touch on some of the previous comments. I mean, with respect to land that's coming out, if that, you know, there's a difference, you know, really a difference between what's buildable in a rural context and what's buildable to an urban level. And so if somebody threw a swap, you know, if we could get 40 acres in and get 200 units on that, and as a result of that swap, what comes out, you know, nets somebody 1 or 2 homes, you know, that's a win for us, from my perspective. And yeah, it does create, you know, a couple more properties out there that are on larger acreage that kind of hem a portion of our city. But frankly, in these areas where you're swapping out, we don't have services. So it's not an area that we would be urbanizing in that direction anytime soon anyway. This concept of capacity, you know, too, in terms of these swaps, part of my, and the concern about, you know, this being a way to do a UGB expansion on the sly. I mean, you know, if we're swapping out acreage and we bring some in and it's at a higher, okay, so our residential buildable lands needs analysis, and we'd want to rely on our existing land needs analysis. Says we have enough for high density and we have enough for low density. So if we bring in land and take out land and we still have enough for both, who cares? Who really cares? I mean, you know, the reason we're bringing it in is it's actually going to get built on, as opposed to just sit on paper as capacity that may or may not get developed in the next 20 years. So I just some thoughts.
Thanks, Heather. And then we'll go to Madeline.
Thanks. Yeah, kind of building on Martha's comment as well as Derek's, thinking about a scenario where there are lots that are not huge, but they're larger, like they might have been rural residential if they would have been outside the UGB. They have been in the county and they're at the top of a ridge. This is hypothetical, but that this city is really unlikely to serve, given maybe parks are around it, you know, we're not going to have a utility easement go through the parks, whatever it might be. I could see that as a potential scenario for a swap. Or maybe that, yeah, maybe that's a just go outside the UGB generally, but because they actually probably could get a well service if they were in the county and they could get a house on it. And thinking about the research document that was linked in this agenda about better planning for residential or rural residential development. And yeah, what is the right use of this property? It's not forest. It doesn't have any trees on it. It's not ag. It's at the top of a ridge. It's not going to get city services. So that's one where I could see it being, going back to rural residential if it was excluded, moved out of the UGB. And then the other comment I wanted to make is we talked a lot about complete neighborhoods last time. And in looking at the OARs for the land swap area, it's pretty specific, right? As far as you're swapping like for residential or for employment. But if you're making a complete neighborhood, and maybe in most cases, it's not going to be big enough to trigger the complete neighborhood planning that you would need. But I just wanted to mention that it didn't really seem like that would be enabled in the current OARs. Thanks.
Thank you, Heather.
Last word on our prolific conversation. Thanks everyone for your comments. Perhaps what goes out becomes part of a city's urban reserve, because at one point it was eligible to come into a city and be part of its UGB. And the question is whether or not that might be a suitable landing place for land that may be untimely. To Derek's point, the urban services aren't reaching that location anytime soon, so it's not within the 20-year planning horizon. But the question might be whether it's suitable to hold and reserve for some future UGB activity, whether that be a swap or an expansion. I'll just leave that there for a moment. My job is to transition us now to urban growth management agreements, which are the undersung, perhaps forgotten about in some cases, mechanism that cities and counties use to manage the land that's within an urban growth boundary. I'd love to have a short discussion today about the merits of keeping urban growth management agreements between cities and counties current. Right now, we have limited guidance on direct, and to my knowledge, no direct administrative rules, direct timelines for updating or criteria for urban growth management agreements, other than perhaps what's been practical and what cities and counties have used in practice. Given the landscape of changing rules around some of our housing rules, in particular, this Urbanization Advisory Committee, I think in our context, it might be prudent to talk about what UGMA's urban growth management agreements are, what opportunities there are to support urbanization of cities through using them or exercising them more frequently, and also perhaps how they may best serve counties. And we've alluded to a number of comments that I'll highlight in your previous conversation about places where urban growth management agreements would be really effective. And Heather, thanks for citing the reference of Dr. Lewis and Bob Parker. They did some work in 2020 about land that is partitioned or divided such that it results in small parcels, less than 2 acres in this context, that are much less likely to achieve urban densities upon inclusion inside or within a UGB. So counties have a very important role in managing in most cases. In some cases, cities manage the land use in their own urban growth boundary. I think we have a couple cities present today that do that work to support their future urbanization within those areas. There are also many counties that do planning work, land use planning for or on behalf of cities within those cities. We've got a real mix throughout the state of different statuses of urban growth management agreements. And thinking about how the zoning designations of those lands that are held in UGBs are managed, how they interface with special districts that service certain areas of those urban growth boundary lands, and perhaps opportunities and challenges that are present in the landscape. So during your conversation a moment ago, we talked a little bit about the likelihood of certain properties being able to divide because their zoning designation is not necessarily overlaid or held in a holding zone of any kind. They exist in rural designation. And if an applicant has the ability or right to move forward with partitioning or subdividing their property in that rural zoning designation, then perhaps that's something that happens in the landscape. I think at the very minimum, counties are obligated to notify cities as a party because it's within their urban growth boundary. But there might be some more robust relationships that we could point to or identify that help counties preserve land in larger lot arrangements. So I cited the 2 acre threshold, which is what Dr. Lewis and Bob Parker talked about in their ex-urban growth article. But there's also some really interesting dynamics that have happened recently between counties being a party to a city's efforts to grow or amend their growth boundary. I know in Millersburg, for example, Lynn County is not in the room right now, but in Millersburg, for example, the county ended up in a position where, contrary to the city's wishes to expand its growth boundary or change the way that its growth boundary was oriented based on where they selected to grow to. And so there might be some opportunity in the development of an urban growth management agreement to better understand where opportunities are for cities to grow and how to hold those lands in certain kinds of zoning so that they're not so that certain investments aren't made that prohibit that land from moving forward as an urban use in the future rather than a rural use in the future. Further, we've heard that there are a few counties that do hold that land within cities' growth boundaries in an urban holding zone type arrangement, and those counties may prefer to, like, there are some scenarios where I've heard colleagues of mine say, you know, there are certain opportunities where maybe it's preferable to allow development to happen closer to cities, knowing that there are services closer into cities rather than putting pressure on truly rural or resource lands that are further afield from a UGB. And the issue here is that we end up oftentimes the resultant of some of that work is allowing partitioning to happen inside growth boundaries. So I think what we're hoping to understand from this topic of urban growth management agreements is what's the best way to move forward to support cities updating urban growth management agreements? What are some key best practices in the formation of urban growth management agreements that not only support counties who are likely the burden of land use falls to them to support or serve the cities for which they are designated. And there's also a question of fees and property tax discussion that it's county land and it's in service to a city in the future. And then what are some of the ways that the land within growth boundaries can be best preserved so that it has the ability to support things like what Heather mentioned, complete communities. We've had a conversation about affordable housing opportunities, and perhaps there are expanded ways that urban growth management agreements could be exercised going forward if those growth management agreements are kept up to date or more current. So I'll open the floor there. I apologize for being rushed through that short explanation, but I think you get the gist that there are agreements that are out there in our universe that sometimes are exercised and sometimes aren't, and perhaps you have some good best practice stories to relate that can help us guide how or if we should make administrative rule amendments to speak to them.
Yeah, thanks. I think we have the perfect group here to comment on this. I think a lot of you all, whether on the county side or the city side, have come across urban growth management agreements, and yeah, curious to hear your experiences and maybe on some of the specific questions that Madeline raised. I'll start picking on people. Go ahead, Kevin.
You know, it occurs to me as I hear this discussion, there is an analogous process that I'm aware of in the Portland metro region, which has to do with urban reserves. So we do have rules in Division 27 that talk about how counties hold lands under an urban reserve designation. I'm not going to hold that out as a perfect example. I, in fact, would be very interested in input from folks who work in the region as to what has worked and what hasn't worked there. It's not the same thing as an urban growth management agreement, which has to do with development within the UGB, but it's a similar idea. These are lands that are presumably will urbanize at some point in the future. What do we do now to preserve those lands for future urbanization? You know, so anyway, I see hands now, so I'll shut up.
Thanks, Kevin. Perfect. Let's go to Casera and then Damien and then Martha.
Right. So I actually wanted to speak to an example of kind of a holding zone within the UGB in the metro area. At least in Washington County, the county applies a future development zone. So as soon as an urban reserve is brought into the UGB, they do a comprehensive plan amendment, they being the county, to apply this kind of interim zoning designation where the minimum acreage is actually 20 acres. So it I think has been effective in limiting the amount of partitioning that happens in these areas. It gets a little tricky when and I think more when it transfers into city zoning. A lot of times you might end up with a 50-acre parcel, and they want to go through in different phases and partition before they do denser development. But that's kind of an issue on the higher density zoning side. So I was surprised in reading this report that so few of the UGMAs were joint efforts. So I think perhaps an administrative rule, it might be helpful to encourage, kind of that joint effort where both the city and county have a clear role in, I guess identifying, who's doing what and when zoning will be applied. The fear, I think, is that development occurs while it's still in the county that might be counter to the city's plans for the area. So some acknowledgement by the county of the plan, even, updating the county's comprehensive plan, natural resource maps, that sort of thing has been effective as well.
Thank you so much, Casera. Damien.
Thanks. So the city of Bend and Deschutes County have a joint management agreement for the Bend urban growth boundary that was adopted in 2017. So not long after our 2016 UGB amendment. This is one example, and so I hope it provides some ideas for rulemaking. In our example, the county delegated authority for the unincorporated areas of our urban growth boundary to the city for planning, zoning, transportation planning, and public facility planning. We also have jurisdiction now over building permits, inspections. The county is still responsible for on-site septic permits. And the Areas that are in the UGB but not annexed yet are designated and zoned urbanizable area. That acts as like a holding zone that doesn't exactly, but closely mirrors what was already allowed under the county zoning. And that zoning is changed, and the plan designation is changed after property has been master planned and then annexed. So the county in this example has delegated the authority and responsibility for all of those functions to the city, so that we can work directly with property owners who are in the UGB but not in the city yet and looking at developing their property. That's our example, and I'm happy to forward this on if anybody wants to look at it for themselves.
That'd be great. Thanks, Damian. Martha.
Thanks. Once again, I have a lot of thoughts, and I could talk about UGMAs for like an hour, and I will try really hard not to, because we have UGMAs with nearly all of our cities, and they're all different. Because there's different situations, and I think it's perfectly reasonable. We have UGMAs for certain cities where, yes, the future urban planning is designated, the city is designated to do that. Similar to the city of Bend, we do stop short generally of the city doing the building permits in those areas, because I feel like that can get a little awkward, because until there's a new zone, the city would then be somehow implementing the regulations in the county zone. But if it's in some sort of future urban holding zone, that might make more sense. I think there's a lot of different ways you can negotiate UGMAs, but I think that I would caution you that sometimes it is very hard to negotiate UGMAs. I mean, they are always joint efforts between the city and the county. It's an intergovernmental agreement, and it comes down to language and lawyers and cities wanting things put in and the counties not wanting to put it in, and counties wanting things in and cities not allowing to put in. And so some of them can take a lot of time. I mean, it's taken over a year to renegotiate some of our UGMAs, and that's, you know, time and staff. And at the end of the day, we often find that not a lot changes, except for what the sticking points are often about annexation and what happens in annexation. Our UGMAs have language about what happens to roads when property is annexed, and that is the language that becomes very sticky. We also sometimes have language in there about what happened, well, like the counties agreed not to create a new urban service district in a certain area. So if somebody wants urban services, they have to annex into the city. I mean, and so there's definitely useful pieces. But if we were put in a position to have to, on any sort of tight schedule, renegotiate all of our UGMAs with like 15 different cities, I mean, that would be a full-time job for a person here doing that. And so that's one of the reasons that a lot of them are not updated on a regular basis, because it's hard and time consuming, and often not a lot changes at the end of the day. With that said, there's lots of different ways you can look at what happens inside the urban growth boundary. Inside the Portland Metro urban growth boundary, land has to be in a 20-acre holding zone until it has some sort of urban or future urban designation. We have some of our land in a future urban designation that has a 10-acre minimum, but even if there's land inside the Portland Metro urban growth boundary that has like a rural residential district with like a 2 or a 5, it's stuck with a 20-acre minimum until it's rezoned to something else. I think that's in the state's rules, or certainly in Metro's rules. We don't do that inside of like the Sandy, Canby, you know, the rural cities urban growth boundaries. We've talked about it. I think there is a concern about, you know, what's the right acreage number. And if somebody has a 5-acre zoning district and then they're going into a holding zone that's 10 acres, people don't like having their property rights taken away from them, even though in theory, like they could annex and get more property rights, right? But so we try to be sensitive to that. I think putting property in holding zones is a good idea, but it's not always as easy as it seems because you're rezoning a bunch of properties. And process-wise, that can be difficult. So those are all my thoughts right now. Like I said, I have spent a lot of time going through all of our UGMAs, and at one point had this really ambitious idea that I was going to prioritize and renegotiate all of them. And I think I've gotten one done. And I'm not even going to tell you how many years ago. It's hard.
Thanks, Martha. That county perspective is really, really helpful. Heather.
I'll just share a little bit about Eugene, very similar to what Bend does, it sounds like, as far as planning work and land use implementation. There's an agreement that the city does that work. Little bit of a different twist in that the plan designations for land inside urbanizable land, so outside city limits, but in the UGB, is the same types of plan designations that are within the city limits. So there's no urbanizable land holding designation. That's already been determined. That also means that, or not necessarily means, but both the city and the county would weigh in on comprehensive plan designation changes in urbanizable land. The city, just commenting on a way that the city has less of an issue with implementing building permit review in that area is because the county and the city adopt, we have our land use code inside the city limits, and then we have an urbanizable land use code, and they mimic each other. They're very similar. And so the same zones and everything. It's just that, you're pretty limited in how much of that can really get utilized because to develop, generally you have to annex. And so then that would kick you into the city code. But it alleviates the issue of the city implementing an urbanizable land code, is that they're the same. It also means that the county has to co-adopt that UT or urbanizable land code. So there's a lot of coordination that happens there. We also apply an urbanizable land overlay zone, and that limits land division that can happen in that area. And it also includes the triggers for annexation or an annexation agreement in limited cases. Yeah, okay, I think that was it.
Thanks, Heather. Before Ken and I wrap things up, I was just wondering if Brandon or Alyssa or Ken have any thoughts to share from your experiences with UGMAs. Putting people potentially on the spot. I know, Brandon, you all did a UGB. Well, let's go to Alyssa, but I know Brandon did a UGB expansion, I think, recently. But go ahead, Alyssa.
I'll be short just because I don't have any experience in Clatsop County with that yet. Anything I would speak to, Ted or Martha could speak to better than me because I know better about my old employers than my current employer. So I don't have anything to add, but I appreciate the discussion.
Great. Brandon, go ahead.
Yeah, we have similar issues with ours in a lot of instances. For us, I guess in my case, I'm lucky that we have a pretty significant surplus of residential land, so it's not something I'll have to tackle anytime soon. We've certainly had a lot of issues. Well, ran out of industrial inventory and gearing up for another UGB expansion on the employment land side. Some of the challenges for us is just with our joint management agreement with the county, we did take over management of all the UGA areas. But our challenge is most of those properties have pre-1972 code zoning ordinances that still apply inside the UGA. So that really has very small parcel sizes. So you're talking generally 1 to 2 acre parcel sizes, which make it difficult for urban development. And then the other issue we have is just a lot of those are Riverview properties. They have water rights. People can have their couple horses and animals. So those are very desirable properties, and there's just not a lot of interest in those coming in. So that's a challenge I will have to sort through probably here in the not too distant future, but not one that's at the top of my priority list right now. And then we certainly argue about roads and when things go to city designation and a couple of the other things that people hit on.
Thank you, Brandon. Martha.
Yeah, I just wanted to also add that I think UGMAs can be a good tool. Certainly for coordination and management of areas that cities are interested in. And I think, and I'm more than happy to continue this discussion at a future time, because I do have a lot of thoughts about UGMAs and things that might make them more useful. But I also want to just throw this out there that not all UGMAs are the same, and not all UGMAs are about future urbanization of land. And so if we're thinking about somehow changing rules around UGMAs, you also need to keep in mind that, like, for example, we have an UGMA with the city of Milwaukee. Everything that is in the Milwaukee's UGMA area is already served with urban services and has urban zoning. And so that's a really different sort of agreement. And so just keep that in the back of your minds if you're thinking about, working on some of these rules, that it's not always about future urbanization. Sometimes it's just about lands that are going to go into the city in the future.
Thank you, Martha. I have a feeling you might hear from some of our DLCD staff as we take a closer look at this.
That's
going
fine. I
forward.
have opinions.
All right.
Glad to hear them, Martha. Thank you.
Just a few minutes left. Karen, do you want to reflect on today or talk about what's up next?
Yeah, absolutely. I was gonna say, Martha, there's nothing I love more than opinionated women. So amen to that. But moving right on down the road here, I think I'm gonna leave it a little bit up in the air because we were thinking about delving into specifically annexations, maybe leaving the broader topic of UGMA and getting really specific around, to your point, Martha, what are some things that could make them more useful if we just narrow the conversation down to annexations? And then I think when we do draft rule writing, Maddie, Jen, and I will consult with Beth and Steve and others in our housing division and in our department around maybe it's not rules for UGMAs. Maybe we wait and we do guidance document for it, and it's very optional if cities and counties want to utilize the guidance document, or if there's some model code language, and then it's very optional if cities and counties want to utilize and adopt some model code language. So I definitely think there's more to follow up with you, but we're contemplating next meeting, delving into annexations a bit. And then maybe there were some really interesting things that came out of today's conversation about the UGB swap and how we might treat outgoing lands. And maybe we could delve into that just a little bit more. I might do a little bit of thinking. I tend to not want this next meeting to be super heavy. It is the last time we will see you all, so I'll try not to cram 4 agenda topics into one meeting. Maybe we'll find 2 that sail to the top. But there might be 2 or 3 things that I heard today that I might throw into an agenda for next time. That's where my thoughts are today. You guys kind of have that roadmap document. You can kind of see how things have shifted and changed. But Steve, you had a couple reminders about the next time we meet.
Yeah.
Just on everybody's radar.
Yeah, and Beth's got her hand up. But first, are we potentially doing any mural board between now and the next meeting, Karen?
I'm going to ask the group. We got really active on mural boards on a few of these meetings. Can I show of hands? Do you folks want a mural board after this meeting? Is there a lot of unset? I don't see any hands going up.
Okay. There was a lot of participation today, so I just wanted to make sure everyone.
Yep, I did not prep one ahead of time. I ran into a time crunch with the holidays. Sorry, y'all.
Okay. Looks all right. Beth, what do you got?
Karen said this is the last time we'll see you, but what she meant is in this year. We'll be back in 2025.
Yeah. Yeah. So just a note, December 17th, another Tuesday, not the regular Thursday, is our next meeting. So make sure you note that. And I guess just thanks for a great conversation today. There was a lot for folks to think about and chew on, and looking forward to seeing you next time on the 17th for our last meeting of 2024. Thanks, everyone.